Thank you everyone for coming tonight, and we appreciate having everyone here on the second of our 10-week series on Vietnam. As we begin every program here at the Silversides, we begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. If you're able, please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The USS Silversides is proud to offer our lecture series. It serves our mission. The mission of the USS Silversides is very simple. It's to honor the veteran, and we do that in two ways. We do that through education and preservation. Every one of you can walk around this museum or look out in the channel and see what we do for preservation. But this is part of our one thing that we try and do, because it's very hard to honor something that you know absolutely nothing about. And we are very lucky that we have that opportunity to be able to do that. And we're thrilled that each and every one of you are here with us in person or as well as online. We ask those of you that have joined us over Zoom, please make sure that your microphones are muted, and that at the end when we have discussion, you may unmute your microphone. If you have any pressing questions that need to be answered in the middle, please put it into the chat box and we will include it there. And if it's possible, I'll ask the question for you. The USS Silversides is a nonprofit organization. We receive no state, federal, or local funding. All of our funding comes from the kind donors within our community, admissions to the museum, as well as through gift shop sales. And we truly appreciate each and every one of you for supporting us in that way, because without you, we cannot do all the things that we want to do. We also have a series supporter, the Birch Foundation out of Holland, Michigan. They're a wonderful couple that met while serving in World War II. And after their active duty employments in World War II, they came back to West Michigan to begin their family, and they both worked in education. Their foundation is based upon the concept that education promotes community service and state service and federal service. And what better way to be a part of our society than to provide service to your community at the state, federal, or local level. And we appreciate them for being one of our primary sponsors. Our additional sponsor, our media sponsor, is Blue Lake Public Radio, and we are grateful to them for all of the wonderful things that they do for us. This is our Fall 2021 lecture series, and this will be the second week of our 10-week series. It's going to be an incredible series that goes on. If any of you missed last week's series lecture, it is available on our YouTube channel. It'll also be posted on Facebook as well. And if you'd like to have a link to that lecture, anyone can email the museum at contactus@silversidesmuseum.org and get the links to those presentations. Next week, we'll have Colonel C.J. Moore will be speaking about nurses in Vietnam. She was active duty for many years, and after she retired from active duty to go into private practice, she became the historian for the Army nurses. And she has done extensive amounts of research into every branch of Army nursing for the course of years. She is currently doing research into the differences in nurses from the Iraq and Afghanistan conflict and how different they are than the nurses that served in Vietnam. And she was telling me about one of the unique things, that in Vietnam, most of the nurses were young women, and they were all lieutenants. Very few were higher than that, very few majors, very few beyond that, except that they were the ones that were in charge of the hospitals. And she was telling me that during the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, their nurses were primarily men. And their nurses were also very high ranking after already served 12 years in the military, and most of them were majors and colonels. And so it's going to be a unique presentation, and we hope to have her back at other points to talk about other conflicts and the differences that they have there. Tonight's presentation is very exciting, and I'm very thrilled to have here Ron Janowski. He has been one of our favorite speakers over the course of time, and we're just thrilled to have him back again. We've scheduled the way that we've done this series a little bit different. A lot of people look at the Vietnam conflict completely chronologically. We've decided to look at it by branch and to look at how each branch was involved in the conflict. And tonight we are very lucky and esteemed to have back in person Ron Janowski. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ron, and I will go in the back and switch the slides. So Ron will talk to you for a moment without a slide.
I am so stoked. God, it's great to be back in person. The Skypes are amazing, but there is so much to be gained by just the back and forth of presenter and audience, and the energy that we generate, tremendous. So I'm so glad you're here. I'm glad I'm here, and we'll go on a presentation today talking about Vietnam. I learned quite a few things actually about the Army in Vietnam in preparing this. And I can see we have quite a few veterans, so I will, Vietnam veterans, so I will do my best, because as you'll see, I missed Vietnam by a year. Actually more than that. And I'll explain that here in just a moment. Okay, am I up?
You are up.
All right, let's see how many people remember this. In the summer of 1972, I was about a month out of high school, and I learned this. One of the first Jody calls I learned. Went into West Point, and I was overwhelmed by the whole experience and the running and the yelling and everything else. And I learned that Jody call, as many of you probably did as well. I knew nothing about Vietnam. I knew nothing about Charlie Kong. I was just this green 18-year-old kid. I knew nothing. Of course, on the other side of the world, there were 18-year-olds that had quite a different experience. They knew all about Vietnam. They knew all about Charlie Kong. And we're going to revisit their experience tonight as we talk about the U.S. Army in Vietnam from 1955 to 1973. I am your host, Ron Janowski. I am a retired lieutenant colonel. And as you can see from the dates of my service, my commissioning in 1976 put me a year past the falling of Saigon. I served with many veterans, however, of the Vietnam era, and got a lot of perspectives, both pro and con. So, let's start by talking about why were we in Vietnam at all? Back in the age of colonies and empires, France established a colony in Southeast Asia, which they called Indochina. Now, Indochina was actually a collaboration of three countries: Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Vietnam stretches a little over 1,000 miles in length, and at its narrowest point, it's about 30 miles wide. Now, it had a history that dated back into the BC era, but it had been a colony of France since 1857, and it had long had dreams of gaining its independence. Perhaps one of its most passionate patriots for independence was this young man, who actually traveled to Paris in 1919 in the hopes that he'd meet his idol, Woodrow Wilson, who at that time was in Paris negotiating the peace treaty of World War I, and he was championing the idea of independence for nationalities. And this young man wanted to meet the great American president and perhaps push his cause and gain support for Vietnamese independence. He never did get to meet Woodrow Wilson. He remained passionate, however. He even sided with the French during World War II to fight the Japanese, who had invaded and occupied Vietnam. With the end of World War II, he returned to his passion and turned to fighting against the French. He took on a new name, Ho Chi Minh. His name translated as clear will or bright spirit. It kind of typified his vision for the future of Vietnam. His hopes for the future took a great step forward in 1954 when the French were defeated by the North Vietnamese army at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It was a earth-shaking moment, very similar to the Japanese defeating the Russians back in 1904, that France had been defeated by this small race of men. The treaty that was written up then to lay out the future of Vietnam at this point, the Geneva Accords, first began, of course, with France leaving the picture. It then, ironically, divided the country along the 17th parallel. This was because there were two competing governments that wanted to control the country. Ho Chi Minh, with his communist government, took the north. And to the south was a democratic government. The peace accords laid out that there would be a 2-year period during which the sides could consolidate, and then there would be elections. However, perhaps because of Ho Chi Minh's strong posture in the area, the South refused to have elections. This, of course, led to the inevitable, a civil war. A few years earlier, Harry S. Truman had pronounced what would become the Truman Doctrine. As we know, the Russians, after World War I, had spread across Eastern Europe and had threatened to continue moving all the way across Europe. Truman stated that the United States is compelled to aid countries in fighting against totalitarian regimes. It was a very thinly veiled competition or pushback to the Russian invasion, and it became the basis of the Cold War. In 1954, it appeared that Vietnam perfectly fit this situation, and the United States stepped forward to present an aid to the Vietnamese people. Under President Dwight Eisenhower, the Military Assistance Advisory Group was established in 1955. Its mission was to help prepare the South Vietnamese from any invasion coming from the north. It was a very small group, initially only a little over 300 people, mostly Army personnel. By 1960, they had expanded to about 700 people. And by 1962, it was actually superseded by another organization, the Military Assistance Command, or MACV. MACV had a similar mission. They were to prepare the South Vietnamese against northern aggression, but with the added component of combat. This combat component is easy to understand if we look at a speech, actually, that was given by Eisenhower in 1954. He spoke of falling dominoes, the fear that if one country fell, it would affect the other countries in the region until they toppled like dominoes to the benefit of the totalitarian invader. The domino theory became a primary component of American policy, geopolitical policy, for the next 40 years. Eisenhower's follow-on, his successor, John F. Kennedy, had run on a strongly, staunchly anti-communist platform. And he had added kind of a muscular component to the domino theory by saying, if we push back, nothing is to be held back, even including military. Hence, MACV was instituted under his watch in 1962. He had a group of advisors, his staff, his cabinet, various military people. These people were considered the top of the line in the United States. They were members of industry, members of the military, policymakers, men who were brilliant. And this book, which came out, called them the best and the brightest. It was felt that with their brains and American technology, there was nothing that the United States could not achieve. Kennedy's policymakers developed a policy of U.S. limited war, advisory only. Of course, the North Vietnamese were going for total war. This was a disconnect, and it would prove fatal to the U.S. effort. In October of 1961, the advisors, which had numbered 700, had all already grown up to about 16,000. They brought technology with them: American helicopters, artillery, advanced weaponry to arm the South Vietnamese, but all within the U.S. policy that the United States had established under the 1955 MACV. One problem for the U.S. was the South Vietnamese president, Diem. A staunch Catholic, he was extremely rigid when it came to his large Buddhist population. He was actually closer to a dictator than a president that we might recognize, and his harsh treatment of the Buddhists led to some horrifying examples of pushback. In 1964, this Buddhist monk went into the middle of an intersection in South Vietnam's Saigon and poured gasoline on himself and lit himself up to protest Diem's harsh rule. Nevertheless, the United States clung to Diem. He might be a jerk, but he's our jerk. Johnson even went so, Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, even went so far as to compare him favorably to Winston Churchill. But by 1963, it was clear that the Vietnamese military were unhappy with Diem's leadership, and they approached the United States to possibly have a coup and dislodge Diem from office. The United States gave kind of murky approval, and all of a sudden, in early November of 1963, Diem was assassinated by his military. Less than 3 weeks later, John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas. The whole idea and the whole prospect of Vietnam in American policy was teetering. Great question as to where do we go now? With Kennedy's death, of course, Lyndon Johnson ascended to the presidency. And it was his decision as to whether or not to continue on in Vietnam or to decrease American presence. He looked at what was being done with the South Vietnamese. He considered the opponent. And only 2 days into his administration, he declared, we're going to stay with Vietnam. We will carry forward John F. Kennedy's legacy, and we will continue to promote freedom and democracy in Vietnam. Events followed quickly in 1964, kind of falling like dominoes themselves. In March, Secretary of Defense McNamara declared that it is in the United States policy and best interest to promote our own credibility and look into possibly bombing the North. We won't be talking about that tonight because that's obviously an Air Force issue. The dominoes continued to fall in short order. In the summer, the CIA began harassing the North Korean and the North Vietnamese because of North Vietnamese troops in the thousands coming down and infiltrating the South. In August of 1964, a U.S. destroyer was approached and attacked, reportedly, by Vietnamese gunboats. Another destroyer was attacked within a few days, and by the 8th of August, the United States had given approval, the Congress had given approval to the President to conduct undeclared war under the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Johnson now had free will to conduct military operations without going through Congress to get approval for each action. MACV strength grew to 23,000. by the middle of '65, 6 months later, it ballooned to 125,000. About twice the size of the South Vietnamese army. The commander of MACV was U.S. Army General William Westmoreland. His plan for ground operations was a four-phased operation. The first step was to defend U.S. bases, primarily in Saigon. The United States would then occupy and consolidate the Central Highlands and establish a strong position from which to send out missions from here. The third step would be, in fact, sending out search and destroy missions from the Central Highlands. Wherever the South identified enemy activity by the North, they would send out units in platoon or company size to find, set, and destroy the North Vietnamese forces. The final step would be to pacify and control the border regions. The border regions were rather porous. The North Vietnamese were resupplying their troops down a trail known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they would come in and seep in and resupply their people. The United States and the MACV wanted to stop that immigration, that filtering in. This was Westmoreland's plan, but it was easy to say, hard to exercise. In the fall of 1965, the 1st Cav Division fought the Battle of Ia Drang Valley. This was to establish that control of the central region. If you saw the movie We Were Soldiers Once, that was an event that occurred during the Ia Drang. From the picture you can see a lot of technology coming in. Hueys flying in, they had artillery, aviation, they had armor where it could be used. It was a high-tech war waged by MACV against a very small people's army of the enemy on foot with handheld weapons for the most part. Now, both sides claimed victory. The United States, the MACV, established what their plan had been to establish that Central Highlands. But interestingly enough, the North Vietnamese felt that after this battle, they were convinced that they could beat MACV. They could defeat the Southern forces. Once the central region was established, the search and destroy began. As I say, search and destroy were generally platoon, about 30, to company, about 100 personnel in size. They would go out and try to find, fix enemy forces. And then they would try to clear the area from populated areas and secure by completely cleaning up any signs, any vestiges of enemy activity in the area. By the fall of 1966, U.S. forces are now up to 240,000. In November of 1967, General Westmoreland gave a press conference. And in speaking of the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, he had this to say. The war has become enormously expensive to him. He's fully mobilized his country, and sending his best troops to the south and supplying them has been a major undertaking. He's had to mobilize a great number of men to keep his transportation system operative. He has nothing to show for his investment. He has not won a single significant victory in the South during the last 1.5 years. William Westmoreland had graduated from West Point in 1936. He had learned all about the art of war by studying Napoleon. He had come of age in World War I, fighting the German army, and he was facing something entirely different in Vietnam. He was not facing an enemy that could be fixed and sighted upon. They would appear, strike, and melt away. Sometimes they would look absolutely innocent. It was almost impossible to see and find and fix the enemy in place and fight them, as General Westmoreland had experienced in Germany in World War II. And on January 31st of 1968, with him truly believing that the North Vietnamese were rocked back on their heels and about to fall apart, he and the country received the shock of large-scale attacks across all of South Vietnam. Broad coordinated attack, 100 different villages, 700,000, nearly 3/4 North Vietnamese troops striking all over in a coordinated effort. This was the Tet Offensive. Now the Tet holiday is their New Year's in January, but the Tet Offensive continued from January all the way through September of that year. The losses by the North Vietnamese were extensive, 40,000. Relatively less, quite a bit less on the US and the Republic of Vietnam side, only 3,000. Westmoreland saw this as a great victory. But the shock back in the United States was that the North Vietnamese were able to do this at all. And the American public became strongly impacted and disenchanted with the war. It had gotten worse, and this made it even more so. In a few weeks, I'll talk more about what happened in the United States during this time. Nevertheless, Westmoreland, believing that he has rocked the North Vietnamese in the battles of the Tet Offensive, increased numbers yet again to its highest number during the entire period of Vietnam. 536,000 troops. But he was troubled by the fact that he could not pin down an enemy. Traditionally, you chase an enemy army to its destruction. Maybe you hold terrain. He could do neither. He couldn't find the enemy and hold him, and nor could he effectively hold terrain, because as soon as night fell, the enemy came out of their dispersed areas and they took back over the territory. As a result, Westmoreland fell upon the infamous use of body counts. I was only a teenager at the time, but I remember seeing the news at night and talking about these incredible body counts. And they were incredible. And largely, they were inflated, as it was revealed later. But it was all that Westmoreland had to try to support his strategy. But the results were almost unreadable at executive level, and worse yet, at the soldier level. It left the impression, the feeling of an endless nightmare. What are we doing? What are we gaining? What are we losing? Are we moving ahead? Are we moving back? Are we winning? This 1,000-yard stare was just a terrible, despondent malaise, and affected many soldiers intensively. And the bodies were coming home. The war was becoming increasingly barbaric. U.S. journalists and photographers were sending home pictures that horrified the American public. And the American public was responding by becoming increasingly agitated over the war in Vietnam. 1968 was the presidential election. Lyndon Johnson had already won re-election, or he had finished John F. Kennedy's term and had been elected in his own right in 1964. He was eligible to run again in 1968. But the war had drained Johnson of his enthusiasm. He had come into the presidency, indeed, he had come into the government as a domestic policy guru. He had hoped that domestic policy, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, would be his legacy. But Vietnam sucked the life out of his administration. It became bigger and bigger, and finally, in March of 1968, he went on TV during a routine news conference, and at the end of it, he declared that he would not run for re-election and would not serve if elected. This left the presidency to be filled by the Republican that year, Richard Nixon, who had run on a campaign promise of getting out of Vietnam. The public was ready, and Nixon had gained a mandate, in effect, by his victory to withdraw from Vietnam. He was going to do this by a policy he called Vietnamization. Vietnamization actually had a very familiar look to it when I started looking into it. It is the training of the South Vietnamese to fight in their own stead, in ever decreasing numbers of American soldiers fighting with them. True to his word, over the next 4 years, the United States did steadily begin decreasing their numbers. From 69, 70, 71, and 72, U.S. troop strength steadily decreased, adding more onto the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese army, to fight the battles with less and less Americans actually at their sides. There are 3 campaigns that kind of illustrate the progress of Vietnamization. The first one was the Cambodian campaign in the spring of 1970. Jointly, U.S. and Vietnamese troops moved into Cambodia intending to strike strongholds of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong armies, capture equipment, capture military leaders if possible. They did not capture the leadership, they did capture large supplies of materiel. February and March of 71, an invasion into a movement into Laos. This was primarily done by South Vietnamese troops. No U.S. ground troops were involved, but the U.S. did provide aviation, artillery, and logistical support. However, the effort failed because of security violations. The enemy was tipped off, and it was not as successful as it might have been otherwise. The last operation was one actually initiated by the North. And similar to the Tet Offensive, there were many strikes during the Easter of 1972, March through October, across various parts of Vietnam. The South Koreans were fighting almost exclusively without the U.S. being involved, using conventional ground artillery and armor forces, but they initially were being pushed back by the North Vietnamese forces until the U.S. aviation assets came in and pushed back the invading North. The North Vietnamese army had about 100,000 casualties. The South Vietnamese about 43,000. This was the last major offensive. Because sides had been meeting in Paris since 1968 to discuss the possibility of peace. By 1973, they finally came to an accord, and they signed the peace accord for Vietnam in January of 1973. Ironically, it was not terribly far from where Ho Chi Minh had been almost 50 years earlier trying to meet Wilson. With the conclusion of combat operations, MAC-V formally deactivated on the 29th of March of '73, officially ending U.S. Army activities in the South. March of '73. Today, the city that formerly was known as Saigon is hardly recognizable. Vietnam has grown into an economic power in Southeast Asia, and Ho Chi Minh City is a dazzling display of light and activity. There are scars on the other side, however, of course. The anguish, the emotional and social and political ramifications of what went on in Vietnam during our time there have yet to be fully resolved. Many of you know far better than I. But regardless, and the loss of 58,000, there are still lessons to be learned, lessons to be gained, even in a debacle. I offer you some. Strategic. Fighting a limited war against an enemy who is willing and all in with a total war is a disaster waiting to happen. The United States withheld, held back. Now certainly we couldn't have gone in with nuclear weapons, but the fact that we went in originally intending it to be a limited advisor role, limited the ability of the military to fight the battles. Tactically, conventional versus guerrilla. Westmoreland had been trained in conventional tactics. He went up against guerrilla tactics. In conventional, you see the enemy, you go for the enemy. You strike the enemy forces. In guerrilla, you avoid that at all costs. Asymmetric warfare, you strike where the enemy is not. And you're driven not by capturing land or armies, but by striving to maintain an idea, a theme. The United States several times has fallen folly to trying to imprint a culture on a people. Now, we've probably been most successful in post-World War II Japan. There, the country went from an emperor society to one of a democracy with a constitution. But we have failed in other places, Vietnam, and more recently in the Middle East, trying to imprint a culture on a people. And finally, underestimating the power of nationalism. A people who believe in an idea, a nationalism, a sect, is a powerful thing. And the United States has turned a blind eye to that, at least in the case of Vietnam, and probably elsewhere. I offer to you one more lesson learned. And it supersedes, it transcends Vietnam or any single event. It is, in fact, history itself. We are currently engaged in a situation where history is being cherry-picked, where people are being told to ignore or throw out certain pieces, that they are not favorable to us and therefore they should not be part of our history. To ignore our own history is at our peril. We might as well say that we never fell down when we were learning how to walk. Indeed, if the philosopher is right, what does not kill me makes me stronger. There is much to be said that the difficult, the challenging rain and storm of our past is far more valuable to our development than the sunshiny days that follow. I recently saw this in a news broadcast. College students were signing a petition saying the Constitution is outdated. It was written by a bunch of guys in powdered wigs. We need a new one. If we allow ignorance of history to continue, we do so at our peril, at our devastating peril. I challenge all of you, no matter how old or young, to go out there and embrace history. Recognize that it is meaningful, more than meaningful. It's made us who we are. We've all had good and bad moments, but they have made us who we are today. And the United States is a country that has a long and distinguished history. Bad spots, good spots, but it's all us, and it has made us who we are. Because as they said, if we do not learn from history, we surely will be doomed to repeat it. What questions do you have? Yes, sir.
One thing, reuniting two countries when we went over, it wasn't reuniting, it was forcing communism on the South. As far as jungle warfare, we learned how to fight jungle warfare. It took a while, we weren't used to it, but we learned how to fight. So we learned during the war. Nationalism, all the South Vietnamese didn't want communism.
Yeah.
I had a chance to talk to an interpreter that we had to walk the jungle with us, and he said he had a cousin who was a Viet Cong. Now he wasn't communist, he didn't want to be communist, but he wanted the South Vietnamese to run their own country. He said the United States will run it like Japan and that. But now him, our interpreter, he didn't want anything to do with communism. That's why he became and worked with the U.S. government and the Army to interpret. He didn't want, there was a lot of people who didn't want communism there, but it was going to be forced down their throat. What happened is the South Vietnamese government was just terrible.
Yeah.
And the United States was terrible. We let, you just were talking about the students, we let the students run Vietnam.
Yeah.
They get up in the streets and protest, and the students have always been wrong. No matter what they've done, they've always been wrong. And they got out there and run the country, and I know for a fact, we had newsmen travel, and they interviewed, I didn't come to, I was in the first platoon, and they interviewed the second platoon. And when I wrote my parents and asked how'd that come out, they told us when it was going to be aired. Well, how it came out? Well, all the soldiers hate fighting over it. They only put the ones who complained and brick. They didn't want to put the ones in there who said that we were right in what we did. So there was a lot of things that were involved that caused us, and from my understanding that the North Vietnamese just came out and made a statement that if the bombing would have continued, they would have been forced to bring their troops home. But we'd bomb and then we'd stop and let them raid, and we did it all the time. We would stop them. We chased the 33 North Vietnamese regiment over across into Laos, or into Cambodia. They crossed the river and started throwing mortars back at us. We asked permission to fire back, and we couldn't. It was a neutral country.
Yeah.
So they pulled us back so they couldn't hit us with mortars. And that's the kind of war we were fighting. Instead of going in and getting their supplies and causing them problems with resupply, they wouldn't let us.
If anyone else, sorry to cut you off for one second. We have a microphone here so that it's easier for everyone to hear. So if anyone else would like to make a comment, just put your hand up and we'll hand you the microphone. So it'll be easier for everyone to hear.
When I was talking with my son about all sorts of things, and he was in college at the time, he was saying, well, Dad, how can you possibly say that? We're looking at the same event. It's data points. I have 40 years more data points than you do. And perhaps with time, you may change your ideas. And he has. He's gotten more data points. Students are not expected to have all the answers. but they are passionate and still are today. I would just wish that we were strong enough to recognize these things, and our political leaders could embrace what has happened in the past and recognize it as we go into the future.
It's even tough for me, because they're teaching socialism and communism in our colleges now. And that's, how do we embrace the students when they come out and they argue stupid stuff that we don't want nothing to do, at least I don't want nothing to do with it. One reason I went to Vietnam.
Yeah. I don't know what to tell you.
Do we have any other questions, comments?
Okay.
We have a microphone, just pass it over there so it's easier for everyone to hear.
Hey, Butch, I was, at least you had leadership that brought you somewhere. I had an ensign that just came out of college and said that the river rats could be run like a grocery store. I knew we were in trouble then. But you know, when you stop and think about the students that were protesting, and I'm thinking right now about the kids that were at Kent State, they were passionate also. In fact, some of them gave their lives because they were so passionate about it. And if it weren't for them, we probably would have still been there. But that brought, that drew a whole lot of controversy, and I think it opened up the eyes of the American people that we finally got out of there. Or we'd have been there for God only, and God is the only one that knows how long we'd have been there. So I say kudos to those kids. Right or wrong or indifferent, it brought attention to the war that was nationally, of a national concern.
Do we have anyone else that would like to have a question or a comment? You might just put your hand up and we'll hand you the microphone. Just 1 second.
Yeah.
We want everyone to be able to hear. We are not all blessed with this wonderful booming voice.
I wasn't going to say anything. It's been, I was in Vietnam 65 and 6. It was probably 3-4 years ago. I had a niece that was getting married up in China. And my nephew, who lives in Holland, was up there with his family. And his son come up to me and says, what's it feel like to kill babies? And I go, what? And
Yeah.
you're going to find out, son, in just a second. I just walked away. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, and that's where education becomes so important, and that's why we run the classes that we run, and why when we have field trips we try to interpret, is the word that we use, because it's very easy just to think of a narrative, and you have to really talk about it. Don't look at it from 2021 perspective. Look at it from the people that actually walked in those shoes, and make them help them to understand what it was that happened in those years. Questions, comments? I have this kind young man that's running around with the microphone for me.
I had a fellow come into my store this last week who was a Vietnam vet, and he had horrifying experiences that he related to me, and I was just aghast. I mean, horrifying. He went down in the spider hole, armed with a 45. For you may not know, the North Vietnamese had underground tunnels, and they would often disappear into these tunnels, and they were camouflaged, and you didn't know what it was until you happened to come upon this hole, pull it open, and it was a dark, dirty hole, and there were bad people in there that wanted to kill you. And they sent, usually smaller soldiers would actually go in with just a pistol to try to find out what was in there.
All them tunnel rats.
Yeah, and this guy was messed up. I mean, here we are 50 years later, and he is seriously messed up.
They asked me because I was a little guy, but I was too scared. I wouldn't go in there.
Well, the stories that he told me, it just, I don't even want to repeat them.
I got just a comment. My dad is right here, and then my son's in between us, so I'm trying to teach him some history. But I served in Iraq,
Yeah.
in Fallujah, and you correlate Afghanistan and Iraq to me together as the war on terror. You know, I mean, after 9/11, you know, that's what caused you know, us to go into Iraq and things of that nature. So everything that's been happening since then has, you know, it's been, I was there in 06 and 07, but everything that's been happening recently has really affected me on a personal level, you know, where I find myself getting down and I watch the news and I get very angry. And I just remember thinking, when that picture you had of the helicopters above the embassies,
Yeah.
and when history repeats itself, when you don't learn. And I just remember thinking in my head when I seen that on Facebook, someone shared it and I saw it. I must have stared at it for 5 minutes. And in my head I went, okay, now I know how my dad feels.
Yeah.
Because it's like a repeat of what he's gone through, and now, I mean, you know, it's the same thing. I feel like we're doing it right here again. You know, just a debacle of a withdrawal, embarrassment. I don't think I've ever, I'm 40 years old now, and I don't think I've ever been as embarrassed as I feel right now. In my, you know, in my lifetime, I obviously didn't experience, you know, 1975 in the fall of Saigon, so I just felt the embarrassment, all the shock, the loss, the blood, you know, everything. Just,
I suspect you're not alone.
no, I'm not. I have a lot of friends that feel the same way, very angry, very upset, you know, and, but it's been, in some ways, a connecting point between us.
Yeah.
I mean, the father-son relationship of Vietnam veterans to Iraq Afghan veterans is, I mean, same type of guerrilla warfare. I mean, very similar scenarios. I mean, Way City to Fallujah. I mean, if you do the, you know, urban fighting, house to house, that type of thing, you know, that I was involved in, a lot of, it's, you know, there's a lot of correlation there, a lot of parallels between the two. So I had to kind of say that after he had said his piece too.
Well, I would hope, I would wish that the threads of continuity that you and your dad have developed because of that common experience might be something that would extend outside this room, outside this city, outside this state. I would wish for that. It won't happen. But the closer we can get to that, the better for all of us. Because honestly, this thing about students saying, yeah, abolish the Constitution.
So we sent him to private school.
For real.
That's where we're headed.
Yeah.
We have a comment in the back here.
And Dr. Seuss has been banned.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Are you familiar with General Krulak? Victor Krulak?
Very much.
Is he Marine?
Yes.
We both are.
He got kicked out of a meeting with Johnson and McNamara when he told them they were fighting the war wrong and they should use what the Marines learned in the Philippines
Yeah.
to fight the war.
Small Wars Manual.
The Philippines back in the 1900s?
Yes.
1900s.
Yeah, okay.
That was required reading before we left for Iraq. The Small
Yeah.
Wars Manual of the 1930s.
Huh. And they threw him out.
Oh yeah, Peru?
He said he was escorted out.
Yeah. He was over that.
Yeah,
There's a lot of recordings
he
that
wasn't a big guy.
people didn't realize were going on during those meetings.
There was a, as I say, I was at West Point during the time as Vietnam was winding down. And one of the courses I took was unconventional warfare. It was guerrilla warfare. And the United States, the military academy was starting to teach it. One of the required books was called The New Centurions. And it was about the French Army's experience in Algeria. And it spoke of, there are two militaries. There is the military that is all shiny and spit shine and they march nicely. And then there are the guys with the dirty boots who get things done. And I think it sounds like General Krulak was part of the latter and Johnson and McNamara were the suits.
Yeah.
Now, politics, Clausewitz said that war is politics by other means. And I think most generals become more and more politically oriented the higher they go. There was recently a letter that came out by 90 general officers condemning what had happened recently in Afghanistan. And I have a few classmates that made 3 and 4 stars, and they didn't sign it. I'm actively on Skype with another friend of mine. We never made general officer, and he's just lambasting them up one side and down the other. But it's politics. They've become political animals.
There was a Marine Battalion commander, I believe he's a lieutenant colonel, that he aired his grievances over Facebook.
Yeah,
And he got relieved of command, but he said, "I'm putting my career on the line. Now let's see if someone higher than me can show their hands."
And in this conversation I had with this friend of mine over Skype, I said, "This is an example. Let me see if this might be in you as I found it in me." That guy was only 3 years away from retirement,
Yeah.
a full retirement, and all benefits.
Yes.
Gave up his career.
Yeah.
And he gave it all up.
But he can
And I asked
see
this
better
friend of
now,
mine,
but-
would you have done it? I would have thought twice,
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
you know? So we're all subject to this corruption. And these general officers, as long as they're active, of course, they got their careers. When they're not active, they're on boards and whatnot. And all that would be up for grabs as well if they came on, and signed that paper. And there was a lieutenant colonel in the Army that did the same thing. He was at 19 years, and that happened about 10 days ago.
Takes guts.
I mean, it does take guts.
I can't say
I'm
I
just
would do the
amazed.
same thing either, yeah. But, roles were reversed and I was in those shoes. I don't know what I'd do either.
Before we close out, I want to say one more thing. Us vets also need to thank the Afghan and Iraq vets.
Amen.
We have one right over there here, second row.
I was a high school student watching the newsreels at home, and I can fully agree. When we watched them, the military was not portrayed very positively. And I don't think they've been portrayed as positively as they should have been with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars either. But I like to think that during the Vietnam War, we were kept safe. We weren't being overrun by communism, and you guys did an excellent job, all of you, and all of the Afghanistan and all of the Iraqi veterans also. I applaud you. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to make a comment?
I just got one.
Okay, we're going to run the mic to you so we can hear you better down there.
For all the Vietnam vets here today, for the last 10 years we've been facilitating PTS groups and all of that business. And I had a Marine one time tell me how much he hated the Vietnamese. And I said, so you've been harboring this for the last 47 years or whatever. He says, absolutely. I said, let's look at it from a different facet of the diamond. I said, let's suppose that the United States, I said, was invaded by an enemy technologically far superior than what we are. I said, they came in, I said, and they did search and destroy missions and all that other business. I said, and in some cases, raped the women. And I said, set their homes on fire. And I said, and I understand all of that business and what's behind that. I said, but let's suppose, I said, that they came into the United States. I said, would you fight them? And of course, it was a resounding heck yes. And I'm just saying heck. I'm not even. And I said, okay. I said, but that's exactly what they did. I said, so we got into a political thing, I said, that they were trying to save face with, at least from my perspective. And I says, and hauled in all these troops, and I said, in some of them, what was it, around 87,200 and something, or 58,000, I'm sorry, I just got it down.
58,000.
And I said, these guys lost their lives. I said, but how many more through wounding and the mental anguish that these guys have harbored for all these years? And I said, so I said, there's two different perspectives, I said, that you can look at here. First of all, we're not going to be attacked by sampans on the coast of California. That's not going to happen. I said, so we have to look at what transpired there, and then of course the rules of engagement and all that other business that played a part into that. So it's just something to think about.
1 second, we're going to get the mic to you.
Thanks. I just want to caution against conflating the North Vietnamese with the South Vietnamese. The South Vietnamese were not invading North Vietnam. It was the other way around.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Well, I would like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. It has been another extraordinarily wonderful presentation by another extraordinarily talented historian that we've had. I hope that I see each and every one of you next week and for the following weeks. And bring your friends, bring your fellow vets. The more people we can get here, the more people can learn the stories. Next week, we will be talking about the Army nurses in Vietnam. So if you know anyone that served in the nurse corps or even the medical corps, encourage them to come. If they're unable to come in person, please have them contact the museum. We will gladly send them the link for the Zoom. And if you're unable to watch at that point, then we do post these on our YouTube channel after the event. It takes us about a week to render them and things like that, but we usually post them about a week afterwards. And so anyone that you can say, hey, that was a great presentation and that you really should see this, or a young person that you would like to share this with, and they're not so inclined to come and hang out in the museum because museums are boring and stuffy and blah. You know, we all know that, and everyone tells people that. But, with me 1 second, there is going to be a YouTube of each and every one of these each and one of these lectures. Please feel free to share them, because knowledge is power. And one of the biggest things that we do here at the museum, it's written right into our mission, is how to honor the veteran. You can't honor something you know nothing about. So therefore share that so that future generations can understand and respect what was done. For that, we have one more question right here.
The question is, I notice we've got quite a few people here tonight. And if we get a large crowd, do we move upstairs?
Yes, we do.
Just wanted to have that said.
Yes,
Thank you.
we do. If we get a large crowd, then we will gladly move upstairs. I am geeked about that. I want to have the largest crowd. I can seat nearly 300 people upstairs, and it would make me more than happy. And I'm allowed to, my fire marshal number is 678. I would love to be in trouble with the fire marshal for having too many people in this building. So if you can help me get to that goal of getting more than 678 people to a lecture so that we can share the important information that there is to share, please do it. I will gladly pay the fine myself.
We'll pass it back.